Hello and welcome to Press TV's live interview with Syria's UN Ambassador Bashar al Jaafari, who joins us live from the UN in this special and exclusive interview. Well, Bashar al Jaafari, welcome to Press TV's interview with you. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. The theme for this interview are new appointments. Let me first get your reaction on this Western-backed opposition who has gotten a new leader, the so-called Syrian National Coalition. I'm sure you heard by now. Has named Hadi al-Bahra as the new president. What do you think?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad and thrilled to be on air with Press TV. Actually, politically speaking, the Syrian government has encouraged all national political forces to engage in what we call the national reconciliation process, which produced very important results so far in terms of reconciling the political forces, antagonist political forces in some hot spots in Syria. So any national political force which is ready to engage with the Syrian government as well as with the fabrics of the Syrian society, I mean the notables and the dignitaries of some areas, are welcomed.
Well, when we take a look at the SNC as a whole, and they have had such replacements happening in the past, and one of the, I guess, common traits seems to be, which we see also on the ground, is the fact that there's been such political infighting. Doesn't that show a lack of credibility when it comes to them being recognized as a whole, given the fact that their history is now marring their present status?
No, I'm not focusing or concentrating on any political force specifically, regardless of your introductory remarks with regard to what happened in Istanbul. I'm addressing the whole issue in terms of its generality, making maybe a focus on this process, very successful process of national reconciliation process. While meeting in Istanbul or in Doha or in Paris or London or wherever you want, these forces are distancing themselves from the Syrian people as well as from the Syrian political forces, active Syrian political forces on the ground. So I'm not talking about the what we call the Syrian opposition abroad. I'm speaking and talking about the national political forces which are ready to engage with the government in what we call the national reconciliation process.
And that is obviously well commended, especially given the fact that Bashar al Jaafari, we saw the overwhelming response based on the most recent elections that saw the appointment of President Bashar al-Assad, and that was very significant, especially one scene which is unforgettable for many, and those were the Syrians over in Lebanon and Beirut. There was, I think, a line around the block and miles, some have said, for them to vote for. But what I'm trying to understand here is how the push, internationally speaking, do you think they are still pushing against the Syrian government? For example, there's been another appointment. As I mentioned, the appointments are the theme. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has named, or is going to name, the Swedish diplomat Staffan de Mistura as a Syria talks mediator. Do you think there's a disconnect from the international community when it comes to officially recognizing the elections there in Syria?
Of course, there is a huge interest in inside the United Nations with regard to the Syrian crisis, as well as with regard to the Iraqi crisis. So yes, there is a kind of awakening, if you want, amongst some circles, inner circles in the UN Secretariat. But that doesn't apply to all the capitals, the big capitals, I mean, because so far there hasn't been any clear, crystal cut changing in the diplomacy of some countries, namely speaking USA, Britain and France and others. So yes, there is some new approaches in the inner circles in the Secretariat of the United Nations, but that has not transpired so far, concretely speaking, in terms of actions or initiatives or changing of policy in the deliberations, whether at the level of the Security Council or outside the Security Council.
Need to get your thoughts on this ISIL, Bashar al Jaafari. I mean, these ISIL Takfiri terrorists, obviously, we're fighting in Syria, and we've seen what is happening in Iraq. If we were to make a comparison, some would like to know, is it because the Syrian army is much stronger in the way that they dealt with the ISIL in Syria? Because what has happened in Iraq is, they've made much more advances, where at the same time over in Syria, the Syrian army have been able to make lots of progress on the ground.
Well, first of all, Syria as well as Iraq, we are fighting the same kind of terrorists in both countries, as you know. We have repeated ad nauseum for years that we were fighting terrorists in Syria, and we have provided evidences to the Secretary General of the United Nations as well as to the members of the Security Council. However, in spite of all these endeavors by the Syrian government, what is commonly called the international community was unable to produce any concrete actions with regard to helping the Syrian government in fighting these terrorist organizations. More importantly, some capitals used to cover up these terrorists by calling them militants or insurgents or fighters or whatever, you name it. So it was somehow desperate to think that these capitals, which are mainly speaking sponsoring these terrorist organizations operating in Syria and Iraq, would change their policy. So after 3 years of war in Syria against terrorist organizations, what we warned against it from the beginning has happened, which is the removing of the terrorist activities from Syria into Iraq, into Lebanon, into Egypt, into Libya itself. I'm sure you have heard what General Haftar, the strongman, the new strongman in Libya, has said. He said yesterday that the Qataris and the government of Erdogan's forces in Libya should leave within 24 hours. So even Libya, which was manipulated, hugely speaking, terrifyingly by the Qataris and the Saudis and the Turks, are now warning, threatening and warning these governments of the necessity to leave Libyan territory within 24 hours. So now everybody knows what is going on, what is happening in this area of the world. It's not about what they used to say, an Arab Spring or Arab Winter or Arab Autumn, you name it. It's about creative chaos invented and set up by American strategists 10 years ago. So Iraq now is facing the same kind of terrorist, and I'm really thrilled that you posed this question about the comparison between what happened in Syria and what happened in Iraq. Because mainly speaking, the alarming news coming from Iraq, which indicate that the terrorists of ISIS put their hands on chemical materials in one of the storage neglected by the UN UNSCOM Committee of Investigation, which was constituted 10 years ago or 15 years ago. These news are very alarming because the same chemicals we are referring to in Al-Muthanna project facility is the same material that the terrorists used in their attacks against civilians in Syria in August last year in the outskirts of Damascus, but before that in Khan al-Asal in Aleppo. So we are here facing the same kind of phenomenon undertaken and conducted by the same kind of terrorist organizations, sponsored by the same guys we were speaking about them from the beginning. It's a big plan. I hope, and I really hope that all these very alarming developments are not what we call a mountain laboring produced a mouse. So we need to awaken ourselves. We need to draw the kind of attention of the public opinion, international public opinion, about what's going on in the area. It's about a war against terrorism.
And my final question to you is, from the outsider looking in, even from people who are familiar with the politics in the region, it is said that the ISIL is the enemy of all countries that are involved in the region. And perhaps it's very confusing then when you talk about some of the countries regionally who are involved in creating some of the havoc that they have, that they're saying the ISIL is the enemy, which makes them the common enemy. But then it doesn't make sense about how you are saying that they're these actors, and you mentioned some countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, who are still creating this havoc. Is there going to be a point where the common interest being ISIL as the enemy going to converge these countries to fight them, or are we still looking at countries regionally who may be somehow indirectly or directly perhaps you can tell us, supporting the ISIL?
Well, I think that our public opinion, as well as our politicians and diplomats, should be aware of the fact that the ultimate goal of those who have concocted this anarchy and messy situation all over the area would be a war among Muslims and Muslims. They call it in the West a Sunni-Shia war. But actually, it's a war against all of us. It's against Sunnis and against Shias. It's against Iran, but also against the Arabs. And we are all deemed to be used as a fuel in this nonsense and a stupid war, which has an ultimate goal, which is to deviate the attention from what the Israelis are doing against the Palestinians. They want to kill the Arab-Israeli conflict by opening up a new conflict based on ethnicities, divergences, religious, sectarians, confessionals, and the best product for them, after having studied the history of the area, would be ultimately this stupid war between Muslims and Muslims. And let them call it between Sunni and Shia. This is why the mainstream media in the West is still using the term of militants, insurgents, Sunni jihadists, etc., to talk about and describe ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. Till now, and in spite of all the atrocities ISIS has done in Syria and Iraq, till now the mainstream media in USA and in Europe also still call these terrorists militants, which means somehow what ISIS is doing is getting the approval and the consent of some capitals which are seeking this destruction of the area, the whole area, through the sectarian confrontation and the confessional confrontation. You have seen recently that even Saudi Arabia now is suffering from the same kind of terrorist phenomenon on its border with Yemen. Libya, I told you what's going on in Libya. Everybody knows what's going on in Libya. Due to the Qatari, Saudi, Turkish interference into the domestic affairs of Libya. Egypt, everybody knows what's going on in Egypt. You have seen with millions of Arabs and Muslims all over the world how Israel is destroying Gaza without any reaction, neither from the United Nations, nor from the Secretariat of the Arab League, nor from the OIC, nor from anybody else. That confirms and corroborates what we are talking about. The West needs to open up a new front and to start a new conflict in the area that would attract the curiosity and deviate the attention from the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian question.
I'm actually told that I have more time to ask you questions. You've granted us this time. We do appreciate it. So let me try to squeeze this one in. This was pretty interesting, and it concerns the United States. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, has actually reached out to Europe and said that Europe, you need to do more to keep your nationals from going into Syria and fighting the government there. I find this piece of news very interesting because maybe it points to, well, it opens many different fronts in terms of questions, but it may point to the fact that there's some differences from countries that are supporting these insurgents, perhaps the U.S. In some ways more. And then I'm going to lead that into what you make of the U.S. asking for more aid, recently asked Congress for the $500 million to support what they call the moderate insurgents. You know, the terminology that they're using with the moderate ones or the less moderate ones, and as you aptly categorize them all as being terrorists, doesn't make quite much sense.
Indeed, it doesn't make any sense because there is no moderate opposition, armed moderate opposition in Syria. The American decision to arm what they call the moderate opposition in Syria and to supply them with weapons and money is an interference, direct interference into the domestic affairs of a sovereign country, which is Syria. And that violates the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. Nobody, neither in USA, nor in Europe, nor in anybody else, in anywhere else, has the prerogatives or the right to interfere into our domestic affairs. Arming terrorists in Syria is like arming terrorists in Iraq, is like arming terrorists in Egypt or Libya or elsewhere. As I said, of course, there are many revelations that have transpired recently with regard, for instance, the manipulation of the so-called chemical file in Syria. Seymour Hersh, the American writer, wrote about it. Robert Fisk, the British writer, wrote about it. The Turkish even opposition media spoke about it. Everybody knows that the whole issue of the so-called chemical file was somehow set up from the beginning and manipulated by foreign intelligences in order to corner the Syrian government and to create the proper atmosphere for an aggression against Syria. So this is why I started my interview with you by saying that, yes, there is a kind of awakening in the West, a very shy awakening actually, but there is an awakening, and people are now aware that something is wrong in the calculations of the American administration. You cannot say on one hand that and this is what President Obama said. On one hand, that he pledged $500 million to help the so-called Syrian moderate opposition. But on the other hand, 2 days after this statement, another statement came from President Obama saying that the coalition is not a political force, a reliable political force. So this contradiction is speaking for itself. Yes, there is a huge confusion in the minds of those who have concocted these diabolic plans for the area to destroy all of us. As I said, we are all deemed to be the fuel of this stupid nonsense war if we fall in the trap of ignorance. This is why we need to aware our public opinion about these very dangerous secretive plans concocted by the foreign intelligences to destroy the whole area in order to safeguard and rescue and maintain the long-term Israeli strategies, which is how to kill the Palestinian question, how to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, how to put an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict without any fair and genuine approach based on the restitution of the Arab-occupied land and the end of the Israeli aggression against its neighbors. So all these issues are really strategic and require a deeper thought from our media in the Arab and Islamic world, as well as from our politicians and diplomats.
It's very interesting how obviously Syria is part of countries that represent the resistance. And of course, when we mention that regionally, we have to bring in a country such as Iran into the picture, which I'd like to get your thoughts on why, well, I should say, were Iran to have been invited in the Geneva talks, would we have seen a different Syria? Would we have seen a different relationship that would have existed between regional countries who have been so much for fighting the Syrian government to these terrorists on the ground? Do you think that would have made a difference in what we're seeing in Syria today were Iran to have been into that equation?
Logically speaking, if we follow the rationale behind what I'm saying, you would notice easily that part of the war waged against Syria is actually a war against Iran. Part of the war waged against Iraq is actually a war against Iran. Part of the war waged against the Lebanese people is actually a war against Iran. This is why I said from the beginning that what's going on in the area is about a strategic plan to reshape the area and the borders of this area and the states of this area after 100 years from the Sykes-Picot Accords of 1916. So the Western capitals are seeking reshaping the fate and the destiny of our area in such a manner that would create the proper circumstances for the appearance of new entities based on ethnicities, based on sectarian and confessional political motivations, etc., etc. All that has only one motivation: how to perpetuate and create similarities with the Zionist experience in Palestine. The only way to justify the presence of Israel in the area at a long term is by repeating the same mistakes in the area, meaning that Israel needs to see a Maronite state in Lebanon, a Shiite state in Syria but also in Iraq, a Sunni state somewhere in Syria and Iraq, an Alawite state, a Druze state, an Ismaili state, a Christian state, etc., 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 so that the area might be divided based on these divids, and on these separation lines, which are not proper at all to the creation of strong states and strong countries. All of that has been tried in the past. It didn't fly. But now they are repeating their plans, but they are naming these plans, giving a new terminology to these plans. They tried very hard during the war between Iraq and Iran to describe the war as a war between Arabs and Persians. It didn't fly, as you know. It didn't fly. Now they are they are repeating the same kind of war, but changing the terminology by saying this time it's not a war between Arabs and Persians. It should be a war between Sunni and Shia, as if Sunni is not Muslims and Shia is not Muslim. So this is a kind of stupidity. Unfortunately, millions of our naive and simple-minded people are falling in this trap, encouraged, of course, by these crazy fatwas emanating from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and elsewhere. So we have to keep our eyes widely open at this scenario, to prevent it by making our public opinion fully aware of these plans, because the mainstream media in the West and the so-called social media are hugely investing into this strategic plan in order to save Israel's interest and to save Israel's strategy from the requirements of genuine and just peace in the area.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have the time, but we do appreciate you giving us the time from your busy schedule at the UN. Thank you very much, Bashar al Jaafari. We were just watching the interview there with Bashar al Jaafari in a face-to-face interview. You can catch a repeat on that on our website, www.presstv.com, under interviews. Thanks for tuning in. It's bye-bye for now.